Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to today's meeting, the history of the future of Syria. We are very fortunate to have with us Mr. Christian Sarner from Princeton University. He is the author of Among the Ruins, Syria, Past and Present, which you can purchase after his presentation. He will discuss today with us what is happening in Syria and what took place in the last 4 years. He will pay special attention to U.S. foreign policy, the growth of terrorism, and especially ISIS, and also the fate of minorities in Syria. Mr. Sarner is a historian of the Middle East, and he spent a number of years in the Levant, I believe the last 7 years. He is a graduate of Princeton University and studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He has written for the Wall Street Journal and the Times Literary Supplement. For those of you who are frequent visitors to our meeting, know that we try and reach out to new experts, new faces, new ideas. So we are in for a very exciting next 25 minutes, and then we will open the floor to your questions, and we have an overflow. We'll take also questions from the overflow. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to be here. I've admired the Wilson Center at a distance for a long time, and it's a thrill to finally be speaking here as an author. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Esfandiari for the invitation, and Kendra Heidemann, who have been so gracious over email in organizing this event. So thank you all for being here. I want to begin very, very briefly by telling you a little bit about the book. What am I doing here? And then we're going to launch into the substance, the history of the future of Syria. So, as Dr. Esfandiari said, my acquaintance with Syria began about 7 years ago. I was at Oxford on my Rhodes Scholarship and began studying Arabic, and received wisdom at the time, said that there were 2 places to go in the Middle East to get very good at Arabic. One was Cairo, which I heard was busy and polluted and too big. And so I, by basically pure chance, ended up in Damascus. And in hindsight, what a random choice, what a random chance it was. I proceeded to spend a period of a few months every year from 2008 until 2010 in Syria, and subsequent to the beginning of the war in 2011, have started living in countries around Syria, so in Beirut and in Amman, where I most recently returned after 9 weeks of research and travel. So that's my personal acquaintance with Syria, a personal snapshot of Syria before the crisis set in. And that's the perspective that I bring to this book. I write not as a policy expert, not as an expert per se on politics, but rather as a historian. And I wrote the book with 2 intentions in mind. The first was to expose to readers a sense of the deep and extremely rich history of Syria, precisely the deep and rich history of Syria that I felt was being neglected. For although despite dominating our world's newspapers in a way unlike ever before, I felt that the 1,000-word op-ed, the 1,000-word newspaper article could not capture the true depth, could not give a true picture of the real historical currents that were in many ways culminating with the events on the ground today. And when I say deep history, I talk not merely about events over the past 40 years, the Ba'ath Party, the Assad family, but also about the deeper past, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and then into my area of expertise, which is the world of late antiquity and early Islam, so the formative events of Islamic history over the course of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. So that was goal number 1, the deep history. And the second goal was to give general readers a sense of the flavor of the country. What were the smells, what were the sights of everyday life in this beautiful and incredible place before it was altered in unimaginable ways by the current fighting. And so I set out to combine these two elements, on the one hand history, on the other hand memoir and reportage, and the product is this book, which came out about 2 weeks ago. It has a hybrid style that some might call unconventional, but I think hopefully the memoir aspects enriches the history, and I hope that the history enriches the memoir. So in the process of writing the book, I racked my brains for conversations and experiences that I had in that period of calm before the start of fighting that in any way could have anticipated what came to pass. And there were many, many snapshots, many memories. But I want to begin my formal comments by just reading to you a brief conversation I had with a friend. This was in a cafe in the old city of Damascus, and we were discussing the election of President Barack Obama. This was the summer of 2009, a mere few months after his election, and we were discussing the historical significance of having an African American in the White House. So to give you some background, my friend is a Sunni Muslim, extremely well educated, curious about the West, curious about American culture, but also extremely Syrian. So he had this to say on the topic of diversity in our country and the topic of diversity in the Middle East. As an American, he said, you like diversity. You have all these races and ethnicities in your country, even a black president. But what if diversity in my society isn't the same as diversity in yours? What if diversity here is a source of weakness, he asked me. Wasn't it diversity that created the violence in Iraq, he pressed on, the existence of all those different groups, Sunni, Shi'i, Christian, Kurdish. I would rather live in a place that did not have diversity and was stable than live in a diverse place that was at constant risk of falling into civil war. So I'll let that pregnant conversation hang in the air for a minute, and I'll return to it at the end of my remarks in the next 15 minutes or so. So what I want to do very briefly is to give you a structural overview of what I think has happened over the past 3 years, where we are currently, and where we're going. So in other words, a quick overview of Syria's recent past, its tragic present, and its uncertain future. So where did we come from, the recent past? As I see it, we can understand the evolution of the conflict in Syria by looking at 3 phases or 3 axes of the revolution. The first and the oldest is that of the civil war. Of course, civil war pitting an axis on the one hand of the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, dominated by his Alawite sect, versus an opposition that comprised mostly of Sunni Muslims. In other words, this was an internal affair reflecting the domestic political situation inside of Syria. Of course, harnessing the currents that were then sweeping across the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, but nonetheless a Syrian phenomenon. This conflict, this first axis, was initially nonviolent. It quickly turned violent. It initially began as a civil society uprising, but quickly turned sectarian. And in the scope of recent history, we remember that when President Assad, Bashar al-Assad II, when he came to power in 2000, it was an era of optimism, of promises of reform, the so-called Damascus Spring. That Damascus Spring came to an abrupt end when this brief period of free speech was closed. And in a certain way, what we were looking at with the crackdown that began in March of 2011 was the final culmination, the final end of this Damascus Spring, and the onset of an even more ominous Arab Spring, or a Syrian version of an Arab Spring. So that's the first axis, a civil war, pitting regime versus opposition. The second axis of the conflict, the next evolution, was the development of this internal civil war into a regional proxy war. And here, the axis that is important to consider and to remember is, of course, that between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other. So, in other words, staunchly Shiite regime in Tehran versus Saudi Arabia and a constellation of other staunchly Sunni regimes based primarily in the Persian Gulf, but drawing in Turkey and other countries. And along with this regional axis came smaller powers. On the side of Iran, Hezbollah and various Iraqi Shiite brigades. And on the side of Saudi and its allies, groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, etc. So that's the second layer of the conflict. The third layer of the conflict was what I like to think of as a renewed global Cold War. And here this draws in conflicts and conflict zones in other parts of the world well outside the Middle East, notably in Ukraine. And here, the axis to keep in mind is that of Russia versus the United States, and more broadly, the European Union. This axis of conflict, of course, followed a bigger thematic axis, the rise of greater Russian assertiveness on the world stage under President Putin, on the one hand, versus what we might characterize as an exhaustion with robust and muscular foreign policy on the part of the United States government. So this is the past. 3 types of evolving conflicts: civil war, regional proxy war, renewed global Cold War, and 3 different axes of struggle: a regime versus an opposition, Iran versus Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Russia versus the United States and the European Union. So where are we now? The question of the present. I like to view this as the moment when Iraq impinged on Syria. When I think back to events a year ago, I, as someone who was a close Syria watcher, I don't think I could have anticipated what would have happened. Of course, the warning signs were there. I think they were there for many of us who follow the Middle East and Syria in particular. But in many ways, the Syrian tragedy seemed so overwhelming, so deep, that the manner in which Syria would end up destabilizing Iraq and Iraq would end up destabilizing Syria was surprising and in many ways unprecedented. Here, the central actor is, of course, ISIS. ISIS, now referring to itself as IS, the Islamic State, was born in the cauldron of the American invasion of Iraq. Originally, bands of militant jihadists trained who cut their teeth in Afghanistan decamped to Iraq, where they became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Incredibly brutal, incredibly successful, until they were quashed by a combination of factors, significant among them, of course, the U.S. surge. Although crushed, they managed to regroup, reorganize, and grow in strength by capitalizing on the chaos that was then unfolding in neighboring Syria. I think many of you will be familiar with the origins of ISIS, but it can be helpful to take a step back and think about what makes ISIS unique. The first is their claim to have established a caliphate, or re-established a caliphate. The word caliphate is a major buzzword in our media today, but I don't think the definition of the caliphate is per se widely known. The caliphate is, of course, the normative form of government that was established by the successors of the Prophet Muhammad, beginning with his immediate successor, Abu Bakr, perpetuated under the series of important and very powerful dynasties that spread Islam from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the Hindu Kush in Central Asia. Over the course of the Middle Ages, the caliphate as a political institution degraded, but its prestige in the eyes of men of religion never vanished. And so even as the caliphate became something of a fiction in reality, the restoration of the caliphate to where it had been at the beginning of Islam, it was always, in a sense, a notional goal to reestablish it. There were many, it was absolved under Ataturk at the beginning of the 20th century, and various Sunni militant groups over the course of the past decades have attempted, or at least claimed to want to restore this, but none have done it until ISIS this past summer. So that's one thing that makes them unique. The alleged realization of the goal of reestablishing this caliphate. The second thing that makes them very unique in my eyes, and it's connected intimately to the first, is that as a group that wages transnational jihad, ISIS is in the business of holding territory. This is the nature of a caliphate. Unlike Al-Qaeda, responsible, for example, the September 11th attacks, these groups, for the most part, did not have an interest in state building. ISIS is quite the opposite. Caliphates hold territory, and that's what makes ISIS special. And the third thing, to my eyes, that makes ISIS unique is that, like many other extremist groups operating inside of Iraq, and to a greater extent inside of Syria, it was born in the cauldron of civil war, of the bedlam that arose in the contest between the regime in Damascus and the opposition. So it may have been born of this cauldron, but what I think is especially unique and interesting is that it did so without per se participating actively in the conflict. This raises a final question regarding the nature of ISIS and where we are today. Where did it come from, and from where was it born? Here, I draw on the comments of especially astute Lebanese writer Ziad Majed, who writes about ISIS having 6 fathers, 6 progenitors that led to its creation. The first is the US occupation of Iraq, self-explanatory. The second is a long tradition of cultural and political despotism in the Middle East. The third is an increasingly assertive form of Iranian political sectarianism that has alienated Sunnis throughout the Middle East. The fourth is the converse of this, an assertive form of Gulf Salafism that seeks to propagate itself well outside the Persian Gulf countries into places like Iraq, Syria, etc., indeed well outside the Middle East. The fifth of Majid's fathers is a historical Puritanism, a vision of the past as a golden age that we must restore in the here and now, hence the claim to reestablish a caliphate. And the sixth and most public and striking feature of ISIS's pedigree is an unusual appetite for seemingly arbitrary and spectacular acts of violence. This tragic present, which I would say has begun really this summer when ISIS jumped onto the world stage, has done many things to the Syrian conflict. Among them, it has upended that series of axes that I spoke about a few minutes ago, those tidy distinctions between regime and opposition, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Russia and the United States. At least for the time being, these tidy axes, these tidy distinctions have vanished in the face of the common threat of ISIS. And finally, it has prompted the US to finally act in Syria. President Obama has been famously hesitant to intervene with poll numbers on his mind. Memories of US invasion of Iraq has not done much up to this date. But of course, ISIS has pushed the United States over the edge, and we are now actively involved. So that's my snapshot of the present. My talk is entitled The Future of the History of Syria, or The History of the Future of Syria, excuse me. So I want to close by telling you what I think, tentatively as a historian, what may be coming down the pipeline. Not to be pessimistic, but I think President Obama has a tough road ahead of him. This is for many, many reasons. Not least of them is the fact that, to my eyes, the United States does not have a clear and robust sense of what our mission is. There have been many conflicting statements over the past weeks and past months about our goals with respect to ISIS. Is it to degrade the organization? Is it to eradicate them altogether? Is it to do something else entirely? That is not clear. And just as our mission is not crystal clear as it should be, the appropriate military response to meet those various missions is also not clear. The eradication of ISIS would require a commitment of military force far beyond anything that we have pledged so far, arguably far beyond anything we pledged in the invasion of Iraq. On the other hand, if our mission is more modest, in other words, the containment of this cancer to the Middle East, then perhaps we can talk about a more modest and a more manageable form of military expenditure that the American public and our president can stomach. Another reason why I think President Obama faces an uphill battle with respect to Syria is this unusually fragile coalition of interests that have converged around the eradication or the degrading of ISIS. I mentioned a moment ago about how ISIS has upended those tidy axes of the Syrian civil war. But I think although, for the time being, countries as varied as the United States, Russia, actors as varied as Hezbollah, and Sunni militants inside of Syria can agree that the eradication of ISIS is in the benefit of everyone, I think that this fragile coalition premised on shared common interests will not last the long term, especially as it becomes clear that the bombing, the military campaigns inside Syria serve to, in fact, help the Assad regime, which seems to me an inevitable conclusion of what's going on right now. This connects to my next point. I believe that there in the medium term and in the long term, high likelihood of the rehabilitation of the Assad regime on the international stage, given the impossible wager between a regime that has massacred countless thousands, tens of thousands of civilians inside its own country, and a radical jihadist group that controls a territory roughly the size of Great Britain. It seems to me that the international community may, in the long run, hold its nose and learn to cooperate with President Assad in a way that it has refused up until now. Another thing coming down the pipeline connects to many of us Americans. 2016. regardless of who the occupant of the White House is after 2016, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, or a certain Republican or any range a certain Democrat or any number of Republicans, I think that we will have a new U.S. president who is not committed to the same long string of statements calling for the ouster of the Assad regime. And as a result of pragmatism and a blank slate, that new U.S. leader will have greater freedom and flexibility to make policy decisions, arguably more muscular military and policy decisions that President Obama did not. So 2 final notes. I don't mean to end on a melancholy note, but Syria is an extremely melancholy story, and this is what I try to bring out in my book. I think the near-term future of Syria will be a tragedy regardless of what happens. I think this will be a tragedy because although the world is acting in a way that it has not before to rescue Syria from ISIS, to rescue the region from this cancer that has metastasized and spread, it has also diverted the world's attention from what are arguably first-order problems inside of Syria. Among these, mass casualties of civilians, millions of refugees that churn on Syria's borders and inside the country, the use of chemical weapons, human rights violations, a collapsed economy that estimates currently say will require at least $200 billion to rebuild. So I think ISIS is diverting the world's attention from this, and that's a tragedy indeed. The second tragedy connects to my research interests as a scholar. As Dr. Esfandiari said, I'm finishing my PhD at Princeton University, and I spend actually most of my time thinking about events that happened a long, long time ago in the pre-modern Middle East, and in particular relations between Muslims and non-Muslim communities. And I think there's good reason to believe that the events that we're witnessing unfolding in the Middle East today represent the tragic culmination of a process that has lasted for more than a century, and that is the process of the gradual cultural homogenization of the Middle East. There are certain groups within this tragedy that have received much more attention in the press than others. Most recently, the Yazidis, the Christians fairly consistently, but many, many other groups. It is a tragedy that has touched Muslims themselves in terms of the segregation, the gradual separation and segregation of formerly mixed neighborhoods. I think of cities like Baghdad and Beirut in this respect. It has touched smaller communities such as Jews, Armenians, Greeks, etc., who once formed great numbers inside the Middle East. And I think the tragic circumstances of the Syrian civil war and now the regional conflagration may lead to the acceleration of this process that has been happening very, very slowly and, to my eyes, relatively undetected for more than a century. And so this final point about the gradual homogenization of the Middle East, the disappearance of communities that have been rooted in the region for centuries and centuries, brings us back to that conversation that I had with my friend in the old city of Damascus in 2009. When I think back to that conversation, his comments, his opinions chafed against me. They seemed so other than my own sensibilities as an American, coming from a society that was rightfully celebrating the progress of a community that had historically been marginal in our society, African Americans, to President Obama, the first black occupant of the White House. So at the time, it grated me, it rubbed me the wrong way. But in hindsight, I wonder whether there was perhaps not some wisdom, but a certain degree of prophecy in what my friend said. Not that the great cultural and religious diversity of the Middle East will inevitably lead to sectarian bloodshed, but there were major unresolved issues in Syria and Iraq before the onset of this fighting, and I think we're seeing the culmination and, in some respects, the natural outplaying of these tensions. It's not clear where we're headed, but I think the future remains very uncertain, and we will see a lot more bloodshed before it's over. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christian. Let me ask you a question. What will it take to defeat ISIS?
Well,
in Syria, and then move on to Iraq? Because, I mean, the way one read about them maybe a year ago or so was a bunch of ragtag sort of people who, out of ideology or whatever, form this group, and also the notion of the caliphate in the 21st century is absurd, even, you know, for a person like me who grew up in Iran. And that's so what will it take to just defeat
And this is the million-dollar question.
them? Yeah.
I don't allege to have a comprehensive answer, but maybe I can give you a few suggestions as what I see it. I think that there are three layers to this. One is a military solution, the other is an ideological solution, and the other is a much more deep social solution. The military solution seems clear, even if accomplishing that goal will be very, very difficult. Here, I think if we want to defeat ISIS militarily, it will involve a large and comprehensive and inclusive coalition of powers inside the Middle East, a coalition of powers that may include groups that we currently do not want fighting ISIS, such as the Syrian regime. That's the military solution. In other words, the continuation of what's happening now and arguably the escalation of it. But the second two, I think, are more interesting. I think that very clearly ISIS is successful not merely because it imposes itself by will on these subject populations, but because, to some extent, the message of ISIS has found fertile soil within these communities. This seems to me a major unanswered question with respect to the events of the past months. Who are the local constituents of ISIS in Syria and in Iraq? And in this respect, providing an ideological alternative, a vision of, say, a political Islam that does not appeal to violence, etc., is the way forward. And this is a generational challenge. But I think countries such as Syria and Iraq can do so in the long term by addressing what lies at the root of all of this, which is, in my opinion, the existence or the absence of inclusive governments within these countries that can empower the diverse ethnic and religious groups that form the matrix of the society. If you have an inclusive society that does not if you have an inclusive Iraqi state that does not disenfranchise Sunnis, you eliminate the pretense upon which ISIS is built.
Okay. Yes, please. And we start here. Can you please wait for the mic and identify yourself? The mic is coming. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Haynes Mahoney. I was the last DCM in Damascus before we shut down the embassy, and after that I spent 2.5 years dealing with the Syrian opposition. And I wonder, you as a historian, looking at the Sunnis, the relationship between the Sunnis and the other sects in Syria, if you, other than the massacres of the mid-19th century, if you've found historical roots both to the frictions that seem to be coming up now and being exploited by ISIS, and to this concept of restoring the caliphate.
Well, you point exactly to the historical example that I would give. There was what many scholars regard as the sectarian turning point, the sectarian watershed in modern Middle Eastern history occurs in the summer of 1860, when a combination of factors, both external, having to do with the politics of the Ottoman Empire, reforms introduced by European powers or imposed on European powers onto the Ottomans, along with internal factors specific to local Levantine society, leads to a massive period of bloodshed in which fighting spills from Mount Lebanon into the old city of Damascus, and estimates vary widely as to the number of Christians who were killed, mostly at the hands of Sunni mobs. The estimates vary as widely from several hundred to several thousand. So I think that is, this is not a continuous story of sectarianism. Sectarianism may be a recurring phenomenon in the history of the Middle East, but we have to be sensitive to the manner in which sectarianism changes over time. And the form of sectarianism that we find, the tensions between Sunnis and Alawites today, may harness themes, may harness messages, may harness a rhetoric that has been very, very familiar in the societies of the Middle East for decades, if not centuries, certainly. But it's also very, very different. So that's what I would say with respect to your first question. With respect to the second question, the caliphate. Even if, as you said, the restoration of the caliphate strikes many Muslims today as completely implausible, basically a pipe dream, it's undeniable that as an institution within Islamic history, the caliphate is the prestige, the sort of paradigmatic way in which Muslims in the past have organized their societies and looked to leadership, and as a result, in sort of an aspirational way today, will often seek to. And what I find extremely interesting about ISIS is that ISIS has, of course, done what none of these other groups. Talk is cheap. You can talk about restoring a caliphate, but not actually go about doing it. And what makes ISIS unique is that they have done it. And so I think that ISIS perceives itself as restoring the great mistake of the 1920s, the abolition of the Caliphate under Ataturk. And I think that among the reasons that they're successful is that even if the violence of ISIS does not resonate with many Muslims, that symbolic act certainly does.
Yes.
My name is Stephen Shore. It was a wonderful, informative talk, but you didn't mention Israel at all. Do the Israelis have any goals in Syria, and if so, are they doing anything to achieve them?
My sense of the Syrian-Israeli relationship over the past decades is that despite formal hostility, these are two countries at war. Someone with an Israeli passport cannot enter Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of anecdotal evidence. The Golan Heights, the 1967 Six-Day War. This was a relation of official tension. But when I look at it, I think what was the quietest border in the Middle East over the past 40 years? In many ways, it was the Golan Heights border between Israel and Syria. And so I think that although there was a rhetoric of hostility, in fact, they had reached a modus vivendi. And I think that explains a large part of the ambivalence of the Israelis towards what is happening in Syria. So on the one hand, the Assad regime was the same regime that ferried weapons from Iran to Hezbollah. Hezbollah would in turn fire them into Israel from southern Lebanon. So that made the Assad regime bad. But on the other hand, the Assad regime, in comparison to certainly many Islamist regimes or many Islamist alternatives, such as the ones that have proliferated these days, could have been much, much worse. And the silence or the reticence of the Israelis over the past 3.5 years has been very interesting. And people that I talk to who know this situation much better than me say that, faced with the prospect of Assad falling, certainly now, in contrast to what happened a few years ago, different situation, but now, I think a lot of my sense is that within Israel, many people would be very content to see Assad stay. Al-Qaeda is literally knocking on their doorstep. There was a fiasco with the capture of Fijian soldiers, UN peacekeepers, at the Quneitra crossing last month. And I think Israel realizes it's the same wager, a precarious stability that you might not like under the Assads, or a freewheeling chaos under this coalition of Islamist groups that you can't stomach.
Yes. Gentlemen, no, behind you, and then we'll take all three in there. Okay.
Yes, Stuart Rosenblatt, I work with EIR. My question to you is, there's a bill in the U.S. Congress. Actually, this goes to your second point of the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's a bill in the U.S. Congress put in by Walter Jones, Steve Lynch, and growing support even during the recess to declassify the original 9/11 report, a missing chapter which purports to show the role of Saudi Arabia, both officially through the embassy and through charities and other institutions, in the funding and orchestrating of the original 9/11 hijackers and the attacks. And there's been increasing coverage of this. Very recently, Senator Bob Graham, who chaired the Intelligence Committee and helped write the report and has been demanding it be declassified, was interviewed and said just in the last couple of weeks that Saudi Arabia has been playing both sides and is directly involved in funding ISIS and the creation of ISIS. And he's been joined by many more people.
Can I have your
my question is, would you, as a historian, would you support the declassification of the 28-page chapter?
As I said at the beginning of my talk, I'm not a policy expert. I'm a historian, and I'd prefer to abstain on the policy question. I can comment on the general historical and cultural context. I think it's undeniable that over the past several years and decades, Saudi Arabia has played, and countries like it, including Qatar, have played both sides of the aisle, so to speak. So on the one hand, these are countries that are aligned to the United States by dint of a convergence of energy, economic interests, and security interests. But on the other hand, by virtue of their own populations, the own ideology that is ascendant within the ruling families, have, of course, been sympathetic to these extremist ideologies. And so, on the one hand, you have regimes that are staunch allies, cooperators of the United States, but on the other hand, appear to, by all reports, be mixed up with groups that are, by the standards of U.S. foreign policy, antithetical to our interests. And so, as I said, I prefer not to comment on the policy aspect of it, but there is great virtue in realizing that, it is a messy situation, and it goes to my comment about this messy coalition of interests and a very loose convergence of interests around the group ISIS.
Christian, we have a question from the overflow Do you think ISIS concept of jihad could extend to Europe, given that a large number of fighters are coming from the West?
I think absolutely, and I think this precise threat that up until now, ISIS, for all of its poisonous rhetoric and its violence, most of its military operations have basically been focused within the region in which it is based. In other words, within Iraq and Syria. It may not be attacking the Syrian regime as robustly as it allegedly claims to, but nonetheless, it has been a local or regional phenomenon. And I think the great worry of someone like President Obama and the international community is that ISIS has the potential to metastasize further and very rapidly become an organization that's not merely about regional jihad, but about transnational jihad, whether in Europe or the United States. And the obvious vector of this are the many foreign fighters who participate in ISIS and have joined it over the past few years.
Gentleman in blue shirt. Yes, please.
Sarang Shidore, University of Texas at Austin. I just have a question picking up on your historical specialty. Of course, this is a caliphate, ISIS. It claims to be one. But if you compare it to the caliphates of West Asia over the past several centuries, I see very striking differences between, say, the Ottoman articulation of the caliphate, where you had the millet system and autonomous governing of each community, whether it's Armenian, Greek, many communities in the Ottoman Empire. Not arguably, actually, exactly, the Ottoman Empire was far more diverse than what succeeded it, and certainly more than Habsburg Europe. So do you want to address the question that this caliphate that ISIS has proclaimed is actually very little to do with deep history or history of previous centuries, but is in fact something rooted in something much more modern and different? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be clear that when I talk about the historical resonance of the idea of the caliphate, I'm not making any claim as to the character of the caliphate that they've established and its similarity to caliphates in past centuries. And I would completely agree with you in the manner of its behavior, how it runs itself. The behavior of this caliphate is utterly counter to that of what we know from the past, whether we're talking about the Ottomans or the Umayyads or the Abbasids, etc. We're dealing with a very, very different world. As you said, not only was the Ottoman Caliphate, in a sense, more practical with respect to its treatment of minority groups. You mentioned the millet system. In the period that I study, under the Umayyads and Abbasids, there are similar governance structures. But we're also talking about very, very different worlds. The Ottoman Empire, throughout much of its early history, was a majority non-Muslim empire, much as the Umayyad Caliphate and the Abbasid Caliphate were majority non-Muslim worlds. You had a Muslim political majority, but a Muslim political majority means something very different than a Muslim demographic majority. And so, in a sense, there was a pragmatism imposed from without on how they regulated intercommunal relations, etc. And so the harshness, the violence that has characterized, the intolerance that has characterized the behavior of ISIS in the name of behaving like a caliphate is, as you say, for the most part, counter to the example and the behavior of most traditional Muslim caliphs throughout history.
Kent, I'll move to the back and then come. Yes.
You, Kent Hughes, here at the Wilson Center, and thank you for a marvelous presentation. In thinking about the future of Syria, will we be looking, say, in a decade at a very different Middle Eastern map, a independent Kurdistan, a Shiistan built around Basra, the Assad regime retreating to the Alawite enclave? What do you see as the future of that Middle Eastern map?
Well, I think we see de facto partition of the Middle East already. It will be interesting to see what the international community does to either formalize or not formalize these borders. But, you know, there have been various appellations given to this. For example, the area under Assad's control has been called by people, you know, in the media, Alawistan, right? Like the territory of the Alawites. I mean, that's probably not the case. But the notion that there will be a de facto partition between a Western Syria that is under the control of the Assad regime versus this kind of wild west, or the wild east, as the case may be, in eastern Syria that is under the control of this probably a loose coalition of Sunni militant groups. And then Iraq, I can certainly see that happening. What I find fascinating as a historian is that many of these regimes in the Middle East including those in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere, have spent much of the past decades decrying the imposition of colonial borders onto their land. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement basically being this colonial adventure of the French and the British, according to their telling, and the borders are not in any way reflective of real communities on the ground. And in many ways, the exact people who decried kind of colonial intervention over the course of the 20th century are now adamantly committed to the protection and preservation of these borders. So in the near term and the midterm, it will be very interesting to see what happens. But I think we effectively see de facto partition, and I think it will be a bit longer before those de facto borders become official borders, if at all.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Greg Aftandilian with the Center for National Policy. My question goes to the Alawite community. There's been some press reports that there's a lot of anger within the Alawite community against Assad because so many of their sons have been killed in the fighting, and he's not his father. In other words, the father dealt with the situation very brutally in the early 80s, but he survived, and now we have this big mess. So is it possible that the Alawites could try to move against Assad to try to preserve their interests, or do they believe, you think, that moving against Assad would just make the whole house of cards fall down? What is the sentiment right now from your perspective? Thank you.
I think the sentiment has changed. This was a major and an open question, I believe, at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, whether the Alawites would close rank around President Assad or whether they would potentially fracture. And I think, as is obvious from events over the past 3.5 years, they have not fractured. And as long as there is an existential threat in the form of these militant Sunni groups, so long as there is a major backer of the Alawite, of the Assad family, of the regime, in the form of Iran and its Hezbollah allies, etc., I don't see the Alawites fracturing. What happens in a world in which Syria calms down, in which the fighting kind of comes to an end, and suddenly, these Alawite families from the mountains who have been sending their sons to die for Assad, they have to cash in their chips. They're owed a great deal, and Assad now has to pay up. That will be an extremely interesting question, and I think that the seeming uniformity and coherence of this regime, around which the Alawites have closed ranks, will look potentially a lot more fragile. But for now, I think the story is clear that there have not been fractures and not been breaks.
Yes, please. And then we'll come.
Hi, Phil Schrafer, a retired international healthcare worker. I wonder if Mr. Sabner would comment on the following thought or possible analysis, that this era is this period and these peoples are also characterized by a long war between Iran and Iraq. Out of that war came a very strong, capable military cadre, and especially special forces men who worked for Saddam Hussein. These now form the core for the Islamic State. And I think that's as much a characteristic as ideological characteristics. Would you comment on that? We have a couple of Pentagon guys here today who might be able to comment on it too. Thank you.
Well, I defer to the expertise of the Pentagon guys if that's the case. From what everything that I have read, yes. I think just as in the case of the Alawites, we were just talking a minute ago, a lot of these groups in the Syrian civil war and Iraq more generally appear to be a monolith from the outside. In other words, a single coherent group with the same interests. And from all the reports that I have read, this seems to be not the case with ISIS. That is, ISIS's leadership appears to be comprised of two groups. One, the leadership, the base that it inherited from al-Qaeda in Iraq, the group that was quashed by the U.S. surge, among other things, on the one hand, and on the other hand, by disaffected Ba'athist military officers who were ousted following the invasion in 2003, and who, by all reports, were radicalized in the prisons over the past decade or so. And these two forces are very, very potent together. I wonder in the long term, or I wonder the depth of this radicalization. The Ba'ath, whether in Iraq or Syria, has had a very ambivalent relationship to religion throughout its history. So I wonder the depth of this radicalization. I don't doubt it, but I want to know more. And I wonder, again, for how long will these two kind of key constituencies stay glued together?
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Nagwa Abdallah from Egypt. You mentioned three solutions for this situation. The military one, the social one, and I would like to add another one is don't you think the political inclusion of political Islam would prevent having another ISIS? Second thing, I would like to know how powerful are ISIS that require all this alliance, like it works in Iraq and Syria, and they are in a very deteriorating situation military-wise. I mean, so is it that powerful that all the Arab countries and United States will have a long time to deal with it? Third thing,
I mean, we stop at that. We are running out of time, and we'll get back to you again if there is
I just
time.
wanted to know what is the social solution he suggests,
But,
because I didn't know.
we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I said in my answer to Hale's question at the beginning, I think a major solution in the long term, perhaps an impossible solution, but one that these countries should work towards, is the creation of more inclusive political systems. And if a more inclusive and representative political system also includes elements and traditions of political Islam, and that sort of satisfies the population at a given time, I think that's that's something that these societies are open to, and this is a reality that, for example, we have to deal with. And with respect to your second question, very quickly, this is a massive military challenge, and I don't think we know precisely what it will take to eliminate it. I can see a massive escalation in the long term to deal with it properly.
Yes.
Thank you. David Trulio, Raytheon Company, and also Senior Fellow at the Homeland Security Policy Institute. As a historian, I may ask you an unfair question, which is to invite you to speculate on the refugee situation and the second and third order effects that you see playing out over time. Well, are there any lessons from history? What do you see happening?
Yeah. Well, the Middle East has, of course, been scarred by many refugee crises over the past half century or so, whether we're talking about the Palestinian refugee crisis or, in countries like Jordan or in Lebanon, et cetera. And I think that these memories hang very heavily over the heads of most people in the Middle East. I just got back from 9 weeks in Jordan and spent an extremely interesting and very moving day inside the Zaatari refugee camp, which over the course of 3 years has become the third or the fourth largest city in all of Jordan. It has over 100,000 people in it. It's incredible. My long-term prediction is that just as the Palestinian refugees, under different circumstances, of course, but just as the Palestinian refugees eventually became these were temporary settlements that eventually became permanent settlements, it's hard to see how something like the Zaatari refugee camp does not go the same way. In other words, this temporary city that essentially looks like a shanty town when you walk in, which at best has corrugated tin houses but basically consists of tents and plastic hovels, how this in the course of the next generation or two will become a major city in the north of Jordan. And I think that same story is likely to play out across the Middle East, whether we're talking about Turkey or Lebanon, et cetera. But not all refugees are the same. There are many refugees who have integrated relatively successfully into their societies. Some have gone near, some have gone far. And so I think among the most destitute, the most desperate, I think permanent cities is what we may be looking at in the long term.
Yes, in the back, please.
Thank you. My name is Aslan Suleiman from Syria. Based on your study in that specific area and what is going on right now, do you think the Kurdistan, the great state, it's about to become a real? Thank you.
I think that I know this has been a long-term goal for the Kurds for many, many years, and that in the midst of this crisis, which is a crisis that threatens everyone inside of Syria and Iraq, the Kurds are unique in that for the first time in a long time, they face a gamble that could, if they play it properly, lead to autonomy. If you're interested in this, I commend an excellent and extremely detailed article that was just published in The New Yorker by Dexter Filkins, which goes into the details of this. And it talks about the wager. On the one hand, how do you deal with the existential threat of ISIS that you as Kurds, you as Kurdistan share with central Iraq, share with the government in Baghdad? But on the other hand, how do you leverage this to create an opportunity for autonomy? And so that seems to be the current direction of history. I can't put a date on it, but I would also not be surprised to see it happen.
Christian, let me ask you a question again from the overflow. It's about the the role of the Syrian coalition. And also whether there are currently 500,000 still employees in the Syrian government. What does the future entail for them if the Syrian coalition, hypothetical case, will win?
Yeah, I mean, this raises for me the example of Iraq. How do you, if you have the stated goal of overthrowing a regime, how do you disaggregate that regime from the professional staff that runs the regime, that runs the state? Can these people be perceived as complicit in the crimes of, say, the military leaders at the top, the people who are running the security services and directing the operations of the army? And it seems to me that no, you can't. I mean, de-Baathification was a very complex and extremely difficult, by the standards of many, failed process that incited a lot of the insurgency in Iraq. And one could imagine something similar happening inside of Syria. I think that for precisely this reason, however, you have an infrastructure, that the regime is identifiable, that it has institutions, that it can enforce treaties and follow up on these things. This is precisely what I think may recommend the Syrian regime in the long run to Western countries, such as the United States, that may not currently be willing to cooperate with it. ISIS doesn't enforce treaties. ISIS does not have a central bank, etc. To be clear, I'm not endorsing this idea, but I'm merely explaining what I see as a potential or a plausible sequence of events in the coming future, and I think this is one of them.
Okay, I asked you the first question. Let me ask you the last question. Iran, as a player in Syria, recently Foreign Minister Zarif talked again about the Syrian people should decide about their future. It mentioned ballot, to ballot. Is that possible, or is it hope? And how much influence do the Iranians really have in Syria?
So I'm sure that the minister realizes the heavy dose of irony in his statement that the Syrian people should decide their future when the Iranians are themselves sending all sorts of logistical, military, and economic support into the country. They do that along with many, many other groups who are intervening from the outside. So it's not merely the Iranians, but of course the Iranians are the most powerful patron of the regime. Earlier someone asked me about the difference between Iran and Russia in the Syrian crisis. Are these two players essentially the same? They're notionally on the same side, on the side of the regime of President Assad, but do they have the same interests? My reading of the situation loosely is that for the Russians, for a variety of reasons, this is a more pragmatic decision. And I think for the Iranians, this is an existential crisis that they must win. And I think this is evidenced by the massive amount of treasure that they have poured in, the massive amount of logistical help they've given to the regime, the mobilization of their allies in the form of Hezbollah and these Iraqi militias. So I think the Iranians are very, very serious about this. And the Iranians have functioned very efficiently. I think their range of policy goals are much closer to being realized in Syria in the long run than I think than their opponents are. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Please join me in thanking Mr. Saleh. Thank you. We'll see you.